and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is October 24th. On this day in 1961, it was a quiet Tuesday in Lincoln, Massachusetts, the kind of day where the air smelled like leaves and wood smoke. Just after 4 p.m., a little girl crossed Old Bedford Road to her neighbor's house and said softly, "Mommy is gone, and the kitchen is covered in red paint." The neighbor called police, and when they arrived just minutes later, they found that it wasn't paint at all. It was blood smeared on the walls and the floor, and 31-year-old Joan Risch was gone. Today, we're discussing the disappearance of Joan Risch. Let's get started. October 24th, 1961 began like any other Tuesday. Before dawn, Joan's husband, Martin, kissed her goodbye and left for a one-day business trip to New York. Joan, who was a former publishing professional turned full-time mother, made breakfast for their 2 kids, 4-year-old Lillian and 2-year-old David. Around 9 a.m., she dropped David off across the street with a neighbor, Barbara Barker, and took Lillian to the dentist in Bedford. Afterward, she stopped at a department store, paid cash for a few small items, and drove home to Old Bedford Road. Throughout the morning, everything looked normal. The milkman and the postman both made their rounds. The dry cleaner came by to pick up Martin's suits. Each one saw Joan, cheerful and put together, moving through her day. After lunch, Joan brought David home and let the children play in the yard. Around 2:15 p.m., Barbara Barker looked out her window and saw Joan walking quickly up her own driveway, hunched forward and carrying something red in both hands. It struck her as odd, but not alarming. But that would become the last confirmed sighting of Joan Risch. At 3:25 p.m., a teenage girl walking home noticed a dirty 2-tone sedan, blue on one side, maybe gray or white on the other, parked near the Risch driveway. Another driver saw what might have been the same car backing out onto the road. Neither sighting seemed meaningful at the time. But then, around 4:15 p.m., little Lillian crossed the street to the Barker's house and said, "Mommy is gone." Police arrived within minutes, but when they got there, they found that the house was quiet. Too quiet. Inside the kitchen, the officers stopped cold. There were bloody smears on the walls, the floors, and the counters. The home phone had been ripped from its wall, and its receiver was thrown into a small garbage can that was now sitting in the middle of the room. A roll of paper towels lay unspooled as if someone had tried to wipe something clean. A child's shirt, David's, was crumpled on the floor and stained with blood. The phone book sat open to a page where families often jotted down emergency numbers. Detectives followed a faint blood trail up the stairs. There were drops on the wall and a handprint on the railing. Outside, the trail continued down to the driveway to Joan's blue Chevrolet. There were smears on the trunk and fender and the hood. But there were no bloody footprints leading away from the scene. And there were no signs of a weapon. Now, the amount of blood, even though it seemed dramatic and was in a lot of different places, was also too little for a fatal injury. It looked like 2 stories at once, an attack and a desperate attempt to get help. By nightfall, Lincoln police, joined by Massachusetts State Police, were canvassing the area. They took statements from neighbors, drivers, and anyone who may have seen something. Before long, a pattern of sightings emerged. A woman, disheveled and seemingly injured, had been seen walking around Route 2A toward Concord around 2:45 p.m. Another motorist reported a woman fitting Joan's description on the median of Route 128 in Waltham between 3:15 and 3:30. She had blood on her legs and her arms were folded over her stomach as if cradling an injury. Police combed every nearby waterway, searched the edges of the Cambridge Reservoir, and checked every hospital within 50 miles. No one matching Joan's description had been admitted. Meanwhile, the 2-tone sedan took on its own mystery. Multiple witnesses placed it near the Risch home around the same time, but no one could produce a plate number or a description of the driver. Inside the house, technicians dusted for prints, finding several partials in blood. But none matched family members, and none led to an arrest. It was as if the person who bled through that house, Joan or someone else, had simply vanished into thin air. But then, months later, a small discovery gave the case an eerie new chapter. A local reporter going through Lincoln's public library catalog noticed several checkout slips signed Joan Risch. The books she had borrowed prior to her disappearance were unsettling. They were titles about missing persons, unsolved murders, and women who disappeared. Investigators pulled the records and counted roughly 25 such titles in the months leading up to October. Had Joan been researching how to stage her own disappearance? That idea fascinated reporters. Over the years, headlines would frame her as the housewife who read about vanishings and then became one. Her family, though, rejected this idea completely. They said that Joan loved her children deeply and that she would never abandon them voluntarily. Friends from college described her as smart, introspective, and grounded. She was someone who read true crime because she was curious, not because she was planning an escape. The books, like the blood, told two stories, and neither one could be proven. Without a body, without a weapon, and without a suspect, the case fractured into theories. One theory suggested that Joan had suffered a medical emergency, perhaps a hemorrhage or a miscarriage, and in her disoriented state had tried to call for help. The ripped phone cord, the paper towels, and the faint trail to the driveway all fit that narrative. But if that were true, where did she go? And why wasn't she found? Another theory pointed to the highway sightings. Maybe Joan, bleeding and confused, collapsed near a construction site along Route 128 and was accidentally buried during ongoing road work. Police did search the area multiple times and found nothing, but in the 90s, even state investigators admitted that the idea still haunted them. Then came the darker theories, abduction or foul play. Some suspected the mysterious blue sedan. Others whispered about a stranger's attack or an acquaintance that she might have met that day. But none of those leads ever solidified into real evidence. And finally, there was the theory that refused to die, that Joan had staged it all. The blood could have come from animal sources, some suggested, and the phone was ripped out to dramatize a struggle. But even the FBI analysts who reviewed the file doubted that scenario. The blood pattern, they said, was too consistent with an actual injury. Decades passed, and the mystery of Old Bedford Road refused to fade. Rewards were offered, tips came in and fizzled out. Every few years, a journalist would rediscover the case and write about the Lincoln mystery, framing it as New England's own suburban ghost story. The Risch home itself was eventually moved, literally. In 1975, when the National Park Service expanded Minuteman National Historical Park, the house was relocated from Old Bedford Road to nearby Lexington. Martin stayed in Lincoln, raising Lillian and David quietly and never having Joan declared legally dead. When he died in 2009, obituaries noted the same unresolved question that had shadowed his life. What happened to Joan? What's left today are fragments. A woman seen carrying something red up her driveway. A phone yanked from the wall and dropped into a trash can. And a little girl telling her neighbor that her mother was gone. On that bright autumn day in 1961, Joan Carolyn Risch stepped out of her own life and into American folklore. 60 years later, Lincoln, Massachusetts still carries her absence like a secret. One that rustles in the trees every October and whispers the same unanswered question. Where did Joan go? Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Joan's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another milestone in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you get to